Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, honorable speakers, moderator, and all participants who have joined this meeting today, welcome to the first International Symposium on Sea Nomads in Southeast Asia. Thank you for joining us here in the symposium, which is a part of pre-event of the Sama Bajau Festival that will be held on 11 to 15 December 2024 in Lubuk Banggai, South Sulawesi, Indonesia. And my name is Bunga. It is obviously an honor for me to be the MC for today's international meeting. Well, the symposium will delve into a pivotal role of the sea nomads in regional maritime trade, their connections to global networks, and the challenges they face due to the climate change, coastal development, and globalizations, factors that threaten their traditional and cultural identities. In addition, we will explore the maritime culture of Southeast Asia as a cornerstone of our regional identity and discuss its potential nomination as a UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage, or we call it ICH. This global recognition would not only safeguard the rich traditions of communities such as the Sama Bajau, Moken Orang Laut, but also celebrate their contributions to ecological sustainability, cultural diversity, and regional history. Well, the symposium will have 4 sessions at all, but before we go to the very first sessions, let's have a look for a while for the introduction from Mr. Dedi Supriyadi Aduri, Senior Researcher, National Research and Innovation Agency of the Republic of Indonesia, as known as BRIN. So, time is yours. We call it respectfully with Bapak Dedi Aduri.
Thank you, Bu Bunga. Good morning, everybody. Or not good morning, actually. Good morning, good day, good evening to some of you. It's an honor for me to introduce our symposium. So let me share you my slide. I think I have quite some time to explain, particularly the background of this symposium, and also at the end of our day, later I also kind of not exactly wrap up, but explaining the way forward after our symposium. So this symposium is organized by a new ministry, but it was actually the initiative was started by the former Ministry of Education and Culture, and it was carried over to a new Ministry of Culture that were formed by the new President Prabowo. So this is very official, but I would like to explain the background of this symposium or international symposium by kind of providing some more personal reflections. So actually it was started by 3 of us, Mas Henry Thomas Simarmata, I believe he is here, Mas Wengki Ariando, and myself, establishing a small group, what we call it as Sea Nomad Contact Group in 2020. So our concern at the time is the looking at marginalizations of the sea nomads, particularly in Indonesia, but we believe it is also the fate of the sea nomad in the Southeast Asia. So we are also started at that time thinking of how we can address that. From what we see, for example, the natures of the current conditions of the sea nomads, we categorize them or differentiate them with 3 categories. The first one is those who still live on boats, practicing semi or nomadic lives, and those who already settle in settlement but still on the waters. And the third one is those who settle on the coastal lands or islands. We see these 3 categories has its rather distinctive characters and also posing different challenges in their life and livelihoods. For example, those who still live in semi-nomadic life on the boats, we see they are considered more as stateless communities, object of pushing away from particular state marine territories, uh, and of course they don't get any state or modern government support for their life and livelihood. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, they are subject of pushing away from the territory of any particular countries. The second category, they already live in the settlement, but still, of course, maintaining their maritime culture, developing livelihoods based on marine resources. They have already more interactions with land-based communities. But in Indonesia, and particularly in Eastern Indonesia, they are living in conservation area, so they are still, being marginalized with, or there are some uh, uh, tensions with the relations with the in their relations with the conservation initiatives, and started to have also some tensions with the uh, peoples of the land. The last category are those who already live in the coastal lands. They economically, it seems they're more advanced compared with other two groups, but they also have serious uh, what do you call it, contesting relations with the land-based people. So again, they also, of course, has engaged in more intensive relations with the land-based communities, which many of them not only has a territorial claim to the land, but also to the coastal water. So the tensions between the two are getting more harder. Yeah. With that concerns, actually, when we are starting to work together, uh, for example, having or get connected to the nomad communities through research or just visiting them. And also, we are also establishing WhatsApp group, which the member of which are majority are the nomads, particularly the Bajau in this case. We also try to connect them, not only the Bajau, but also other stakeholder, representative of other stakeholder in this regard, for example, academia, and also government institutions as well as NGOs. So this slide show you all the Zoomina that we organize to connect these agencies with the Bajau. We also try to be connected to regional Southeast Asian connections who are working on nomads. You can see some of you are here in these slides. It was started last year, and then we discussed our set concerns, and also thinking of what we can work together. The last activity that we work on also kind of preparing a report to the UN institutions to uh, describe and also uh, uh, informing the conditions of the nomads, particularly in certain issues that are also the concerns of the UN organizations. So now when we start thinking about this symposium, actually it was started by the approach from the Ministry of Education and Culture. As I mentioned earlier, it was started from the Jokowi's cabinet. They are having a plan to propose the Nomad as in the cult the in Nomad as the world heritage for its intangible cultures, yeah, and also planning to organize the Bajau Congress. So we are very happy being approached by the minister staffs, and we see it as a great opportunity by which the initiative started by the government. So what we see is that there's a formal government attention for Orang Bajau. With that, we are trying to expand the idea of the original plan from the ministry to also the ministry concerned on Bajau initially. So we discussed with them to expand the idea to cover all nomads, because if we are talking about Southeast Asia, it's not only the Bajau but other nomads also in living in this area. With that, we also adding the international symposium that we have now into the agenda. We believe that the knowledge that we have accumulated to your works is also enormous. This is a good modalities for not only understanding Bajau or the nomads more, but also trying to connect all of the people who have similar or shared concerns about the nomads. So we are, as you, of course, aware that not experienced, not aware, we are contacting you individually, and we are also contacting some institutions to work together with us, particularly for this symposium, but also from other events that we are going to organize in this series. So the symposium's goal are promoting understandings to enhance understanding of the said maritime heritage and cultural practices of the sea nomad in Southeast Asia regions. The second one, identify the common challenge faced by the sea nomads, including those related to resource management, livelihoods, mobility, climate change, and cultural preservations, and explore the opportunities for collaborations and knowledge sharing between sea nomads communities in the Southeast Asia region. And also, lastly, foster our strengthened partnership between government agencies, NGOs, and academic institutions working with the sea nomads. With that, we formulate 4 different topics for this, which then spread into 4 different panels. The first one is maritime culture and networks of sea nomads in Southeast Asia. The second one is livelihood and development discourses and practices. The third one, rights, arts, and movements. And the last one is Austronesian diaspora and legacy. So these are the things that we would like to discuss in our symposium. So because of the time zone difference, so we cannot really put the panels in the right panels topic. Yeah, we are starting with those who are in the most Western time zone. So it's already daytime there, so we won't be too late for them to present. And we are also waiting for those in the Western time zone to wake up and ready for presentations. So this is why our presenters in this panels is not really talking in the context of its panel topics. For example, in this first panels, we will have James, which will lay the foundations of understanding the mobility of the sea nomads in the context of the Austronesians. Historically and in the contemporary conditions on time, we will have Greg will talk about the intricacy of the relations, internal relation between Bajau Tempatan and Bajau Laut, and we'll have Professor Cynthia Chou talking about the intricacy of relations of the sea nomads with the sea, and we'll have Pak Surya Chandra. For those who are not know him yet, he was the vice ministry of Agrarian Ministry in Indonesia during the Pak Jokowi's tenure. So he's the one who get info, maybe initiated the agrarian reform by which the Bajau or Nomads is the objects. He will talk about the distributions of land certificates for the Nomads. But Lilis will help us to moderate the discussions. In the second session, we will have Professor Pancho Robert Jacot to also discuss the natures of the nomads and in relation to the developments. Mas Wenki will talk about sustainable and coastal marine grabbing. We can also see how the Indonesian sea nomads fight with positions in the context of Indonesian developments. We'll have Professor Gusti Saad from University College Sabah Foundation. Will talk about the conditions of Sama Bajau in Malaysia. We'll have Professor Narumot talking about the sea nomads in Thailand and in the context of developments in the Thailand. We'll have Ibu Sandra to moderate the panels. And in the second session, we will have Professor Muchasin. She will talk about Sama Bajau in the Philippines, human rights, conflict, and transformations. And then we will have Firdaus Sani. He is a young who is fighting for the rights of nomad in Singapore. So we'll hear an interesting story from him, having him as a representative of the nomads. I think it's a good opportunity in these symposiums. From Maxine Bontri, we'll talk about Moken, a live museum in Myanmar. Dr. Pitayapon from Chulalongkorn University will talk about tracing movement of Moken population through language contact. So, Mas Henry Thomas Simarmata will help with moderating these sections. The last sessions, we will have Makibi, who has a rich experience of doing research in of the Bajau people in Eastern Indonesia, particularly is talking about seasonal calendar of Sama Bajau people. Professor Harawati Sudoyo will talk about genomic origin. I think the presentation will be interesting if we connect it to Pak Jim's story of the migrations and the cultural differences of the different routes. Ibu Herawati will talk about the fact that there's in the blood of the Bajau there are also others ethnic group in mixed inside. Ibu Chandra Nuraini will talk about the epics and public scans of the Bajau community in Indonesia. We will hear the voice of the oral history of the Bajau from her. And the last presentation is quite important as well from Veda Sandiaji, talking about the positions of the nomads, particularly the Bajau, in the context of conservations in the Coral Triangle Initiative. We will have Adrian Perkasa to moderate these sessions. At the end, I will not wrap up this symposium, but discussing more the way forward after our symposiums. And finally, Professor Najib Burhani from the National Research and Innovation Agency will close the symposium. So again, thank you and great appreciation to all speakers, particularly to the fact that we kind of dalam bahasa Indonesia menodong to participate and presenting your research in our symposium. It's very short notice, so we are very much appreciating the kindness of you to be here and present your work. I would like also to thank you to collaborator institutions. I already mentioned all of them, and also thank you very much for symposium participants and supporters. I think I should stop there as an introduction. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Bapak Dedi Aduri, for the delightful introductions. And distinguished ladies and gentlemen, our honorable speakers, moderators, and all the participants. And unfortunately, Bapak Menteri Kebudayaan, Mr. Fadlizon, can make it today. But I believe this discussion will go straightly still an interesting and conducive situation. So sorry from him and wish he can make it in our next sessions, symposiums, right? Well, now it's time to jump into the first sessions, which has been mentioned, like Dedi Aduri said before. Our first sessions with the theme Maritime Culture and Network of Sea Nomads in Southeast Asia will have a time about 90 minutes to go, which we have 4 speakers. Prof. James Fox, the Australian National University.
Thank you, Mbak Bunga. Thank you very much, host. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, good afternoon, and good day to everyone, wherever you are. It's really great for us to meet in Zoom for the first for the first international symposium on sea nomads in Southeast Asia. My name is Lilis Mulyani. I am a researcher at the National Research and Innovation Agency, or BRIN. And we are really excited about this topic, the first session on maritime culture and networks of sea nomads in Southeast Asia, with 4 distinguished speakers. Pak Jim from Australian National University, Pak Greg, Ibu Cynthia, and also Mas Surya, whom I have known for quite some time. For the first session, we will discuss mainly topics regarding the current and also the history of sea nomads issues, their challenges in order to understand the sea nomad historical and cultural networks across Southeast Asia. We also hope to gain more understanding on their identity, migration patterns, ethnographic, their cultures and territories, and also many attempts to increase their security and livelihood through government programs such as agrarian reform and other programs. And for the first speaker, I would like to invite Professor James Fox, Pak Jim. Allow me to read a short bio of Professor Jim Fox. He's an emeritus professor at the Australian National University, educated at Harvard and Oxford, and has taught at various American and European universities. He is a foreign fellow at Royal Dutch Academy of Science and a fellow of Academy of Social Science in Australia. He has also served as adjunct professor in anthropology at the University of Indonesia and currently chair of the ANU Emeritus Faculty. Professor Fox's areas of primary interest is Indonesia, with special focus on Java and Eastern Indonesia. He has written extensively on maritime history and social relations in Eastern Indonesia. In September 2024, he delivered the Adrian B. Lapian Memorial Lecture, and his most recent book, published in November 2024, is Ritual Voices of Revelations, The Origin Narratives of the Rottenness of Eastern Indonesia. Pak Jim, the screen is yours. You are still on. You
Okay.
still, yes.
All right. Terima
Right.
kasih.
Yes.
Terima kasih. I want to begin by thanking first the ministry and then BRIN and then all of the individual organizers for this symposium. It's appropriate, timely, and very important. My role today will be simply to set certain scenes, and from there I will, I hope that the rest of the conference will be more interesting. All right, can you see my screen? Good. Now, what I want to do is, the goal of this presentation is very simple. I want to talk about the spatial, historical, and social context for understanding sea nomads, the specific sea nomads that we know today, but more broadly, the sea nomads who have existed in the past and have been very important to the very foundations of the social organizations and cultures of all of Nusantara.
Jim,
Jim,
I don't think
maaf.
you have shared the screen, the PowerPoint yet.
Sorry, it's not yet full?
No, you haven't shared it.
Oh, sorry, there. All right. Can you see now?
Okay, Pak, we are helping you, Pak. So,
Yes, you can continue, Pak Jim.
Well, all right. So let me start again. I said I'm talking about the spatial, historical, and social context. Now, the first is the wider context. This wider context looks at the Austronesian migration. Next slide. I have no visibility here. One moment. Give me a moment. Okay. All right. Now I can. All right. Can we go to the next one, the wider context?
Yes, Pak Jim.
All right. The wider context. And the wider context is the Austronesian migration. So next slide. If you look at this Austronesian migration, it was at its time and afterwards, the largest migration, the largest linguistic dispersal of any that occurred in human history. And as I've said, it begins in Taiwan, in Formosa, and extends from Taiwan to Timor, and from Madagascar on the coast of Africa to Easter Island in the far Pacific. Now, this was a major migration, a major maritime migration. Next slide. It was made possible by a remarkable but yet very simple technology, what are called lash-lugged sewn-planked vessels. The way you build up a vessel, almost from a canoe type vessel. You had flexible mounted 3 or 4-sided sails. These are kind of windsurfer sails. Most important, and this is something I emphasized in my Lapian lecture, you had modular palm leaf sails. Sails were not a single piece of cloth. Cloth was not available. Using palm leaf, it was knitted together in many different sections. And then finally, you had the outrigger or 2 outriggers for establishing stability. And this technology is what spread the Austronesians from Madagascar all the way to the far Pacific. And we see pictures of this kind of technology in use. One of those is a drawing of the early Makasan sailing vessels on the coast of Australia. Next slide. Here now we go to a specific context. This is a specific context from which we hone in on the migrations that are significant for our discussion. Next slide. what you see here are three pathways, from the Pacific. Imagine from the Philippines. Imagine the Philippines as a launching point. The Austronesians migrated from Taiwan to the Philippines, and then from the Philippines, that became a launching point for populations going down further. And I talk about this, you could almost say the Tiga Lorong Laut that distributed Austronesians into Indonesia. The first in Zone 1 is a very important migration, probably the most important migration, all the way across. And the Zone 1 includes the Vietnamese coast, the coast of Kalimantan, Borneo, Malaysia, Sumatra, and even Java. All of that was a major zone of innovation. The second is the one that is most notable and occurs in eastern Indonesia, beginning in eastern Sumbawa and Flores. And the third, and another very important zone of innovation, is the one that occurs in Halmahera and the New Guinea coast, all the way down to Maluku. Why do I call these different zones? These were zones of innovation where Austronesians met non-Austronesians. And in the contact between Austronesians and non-Austronesians, there was all sorts of innovation in the social organization and in the way the societies were structured. I'll talk more about this. Let's go on. Next slide. In Zone 1, what happened was there was a development, a contact mainly with the Austroasiatic populations, and there was the societies were bilateral. There was relative age, elder-younger is very important, and individual marriages. You had many different individual marriages, and the idea of besan, the connection between the parents of individuals who married, but every marriage was creating its own connection. In Zone 2, something very interesting happens. There is the beginning of lineality, which means the beginning of a clan structure. There are very gender-specific relative age. You can apply relative age brother to brother and sister to sister, but there are different designations for brother to sister. And finally, there begins what looks like and becomes more developed a kind of designated marriage systems where clans begin to exchange, and they exchange, in some cases, if they're patrilineal, they exchange women. If they're matrilineal, they exchange men. Finally, in Zone 3 is a further transformation of the Austronesians. There's developed lineality, very strong lineality. There is no relative age, so you don't distinguish between kakak-adik. And then there are special categories for cross cousins. So if you go from Zone 1 to Zone 3, there is a radical change in the kinds of structures in the Austronesian societies. Let's go on. Now, when we look at just the present-day Austronesian sea nomads, the Samal Bajau speakers, the Malayic speakers of the sea nomads of the Sumatra coast, the Moklen speaking, Makwen, for example, of the Mergui coast, all of these sea nomads possess the social features based on innovations that developed in Zone 1. They're bilateral, relative age is important, but not sex-specific, and in the ability to create alliances, arrangements are by individual marriage systems. All of those are very distinctive and different from what happens in Zone 2 and Zone 3. All right, let's go on. In the paper I prepared for this talk, I go at some lengths about what the Fayose did. when the Dutch East India Company arrived in Indonesia, they put an interdiction and restriction on trade, maritime trade, and especially on mobility. So let's go to the next slide. The VOC established and signed contracts, contracten, with hundreds upon hundreds of individual local rulers throughout Indonesia. They channeled trade through the company and restricted regional maritime exchange and mobility. Now, what's interesting, in those restrictions, which lasted from about 1640 to the beginning of the 19th century, during that time, one of the most interesting features is that the Bajau Laut continued to migrate. And I have, in my paper and in my Lapian lecture, I look at some of the Dutch East India Company records that show how the Bajau were sailing south from Sulawesi down to Alor, and from Alor all the way down to Roti by 1728. Next slide. By 1728, the Bajau Laut had sailed in their family boats as far as Roti, and I think there is very strong evidence this was just the beginning of the further migration and further exploration by the Bajau Laut all the way down to the north coast of Australia. They'd reached the north coast of Australia sometime before 1750. All right, this is an interesting thing because the effect of the company's presence for almost 150, 200 years made a difference in Austronesian mobility and the way we see Austronesian mobility today. So going back, next slide. If we go back to this place, if you see the zone 1, which is what I call an Austronesian sea, the Austronesian sea world. This sea world is, out of this sea world, there grew all of the maritime populations that became historically important. And I include those, very important, the Cham and the Javanese. In fact, the Cham and the Javanese, in terms of the innovations that they developed in their social organization, look very, very similar. The Sundanese came out of this sea world, as did the Acciaioli, many different Malay groups, the Moderese, and others. And I point and just add to one other, the Barito-speaking populations of Madagascar, because the Barito populations of Madagascar were the ones that sailed all the way to Africa. They were sailing not as simple boats crewed by men, but within family boats, because they gave rise to the population of Madagascar. And it's those Barito population that also came out of this sea world of Zone 1. Next slide. And now I come to just one last glimpse. I call it a further glimpse because it's a glimpse of what we are only beginning to understand. At least I'm pointing to it as something that has to be investigation, something that was an unknown unknown, and is now an unknown, now a known unknown and needs investigation. So my final slide. Can we go to the next slide? Here we have, there is evidence, there is very significant linguistic and anthropological evidence that there was a migration from what I'm calling Zone 3, which is, you could say, the Halmahera, but more important, Maluku, a back migration. We know there was a very strong migration from Zone 3 into the Pacific, and that's easy to chart. But there is another migration that goes from zone 3 back all the way across eastern Indonesia, has effects in eastern Indonesia. And I think there is evidence that it has an effect. They sailed into zone 1 and certainly along the Sumatran coast, and affected some of the Sumatran populations of today. So that is, I leave this discussion with the fact that sea nomads of the past as a more complex and needs to be further investigated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Jim. That was a very insightful talk that highlighted the historical aspect of maritime mobility and migrations of the early Austronesian people, extending across the Indian Ocean into the Pacific. I think the major migrations from the Madagascar to the Pacific, including tiga lorong laut, or three pathways, sea pathways, from the Philippines to Indonesia, and how this migration influenced the formation of numerous maritime populations. A further question probably is what drives these migrations. It's really interesting to know about the factors. So let us move to our second speaker, Professor Greg Acciaioli. I'm sorry if I pronounce it incorrectly. But before that, I would like to reintroduce Prof. Greg, although many of us have already known Pak Greg for his works in Indonesia. And so your talk today is actually a joint collaboration with Fazilah Majid Cook from University Malaysia Terengganu. Let me introduce both of you. Pak Greg is a senior honorary research fellow at the School of Social Science, the University of Western Australia, as well as Curtin University. He has been a principal investigator on several Australian Research Council research projects and has written on resource contestation in protected area settings such as national parks, indigeneity in Indonesia and Malaysia, development programs and poverty, statelessness in Sabah, and other topics. His Sabah research has also focused on Islamization in these Malaysian states, as evident with the publication authored with Majid Cook, positioning Bajau identities as Bumi Putra, and then also he written discourses in discourses, agency, and identity in Malaysia, including masyarakat pinggiran in Indonesia sekarang. And Professor Fazilah Majid Cook, or Professor Majid, is a professor of environmental sociology, has worked for 20 years in natural resource governance, forest, customary land, and water, and in participatory development in Malaysia. Her current research is on social learning, citizen science, and Islam from below. I think to cut time short, please project, the screen is yours.
Okay, terima kasih. Can you see my PowerPoint? And is it in screen slideshow mode?
Not yet, not in slideshow mode.
Because it is on my screen.
Yes, now it's all good, Patrick. It's in slideshow mode now. Good.
Okay. Let me just set the timer. Okay. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, salam sehat kepada semua. I'm going to talk about processes of ethnogenesis, particularly not assimilation, but processes of distinction. How Bajau, or sometimes you can call them Bajau Tempatan, the local Bajau, citizen Bajau of Eastern Sabah, differentiate themselves from the Bajau Laut as a persisting process. Now, the larger context is provided by the Sulu zone as it was enunciated by James Warren. And although he talks about it primarily as an economic zone with marine products, coastal products being sent to Holo and then on to China, it is also a political arena with continuing processes of reconstructing ethnic identity in situations of conflict and alliance. Now, this relatively recent definition he gives emphasizes it as an economic region, but it also emphasizes the importance of Islam as constituting the hierarchy, with the Sulu Sultanate under the Tausuga at the top, and at the margins, the Sama Bajau populations collecting marine products. The anthropologist Charles Frake presents a similar picture of this region. And let me just emphasize how he says ethnic labels themselves are among the weapons used for interaction in the region. Both Warren and Frake emphasize as a case study the ethnogenesis of the Balangingi. Warren calls them an emergent society that were constituted by the incorporation of captives who themselves become Balangingi Sama. These captives would include Christian Indios from the Visayan and Tagalog regions and such. Frake presents a similar picture, but goes further in saying that the Balangingi sought further distinction from local populations by dropping the term Sama from their ethnic label and simply becoming the Balangingi. Now, there's an analogous process of amalgamation to form an ethnic category that is detailed by Nagatsu among the Bajau Sapekan. He says the rise to population dominance in Sapekan of the Bajau is not due to a migration influx of further Bajau, but by the Mandar, Bugis, and even Chinese converting to essentially Masuk Bajau, adopting local dialect of the Sama language to conduct interactions, and adopting a hybrid culture. He calls this accommodation, the conversion of majority groups to the identity of a minority, and contrasts it to assimilation, the conversion of a marginal group to a majority identity. Now, this demonstrates how ethnicity is performative. One becomes Bajau by adopting a maritime orientation in livelihood practice and adopting the Bajau language. But there's nothing unique about that. The definition of Malayu throughout the archipelago is performative rather than descent-based. And it's not unique to this region. Becoming Vezo in southwestern Madagascar is a matter of adopting a fishing-oriented livelihood rather than based on descent criteria. Now, while there are these processes of accommodation and assimilation in ethnogenesis, I'm going to concentrate on the complementary process of distinction, of how a group comes to distinguish itself from others that they do not want to incorporate. One can see this with the Balangingi Sama becoming Balangingi and such. And there are other examples, but I'm going to concentrate on distinction-maintaining processes between the Bajau of southeastern Sabah, also sometimes called Bajau Tempatan, local or in-place Bajau, formerly called Bajau Kubang, and the Bajau Laut. And I'm going to emphasize the centrality of the performance of Bajau Tempatan in this, particularly in the performance of the Kenduri, a communal feast. Now, the larger context of this is the increasing Malay Islamization that has been propounded by the Malaysian state, something that was furthered in Sabah, particularly during the regime of the chief minister, Tun Mustafa, where there was a transition later between trying to convert Christian populations to an emphasis upon presenting a more orthodox Islam to the already existing heterodox Islamic populations of Sabah through the process of Dakwah, bringing religious scholars and teachers from West Malaysia. Now, this Dakwahization has spawned a certain resistance especially attempts to consider local festivals, local ritual gatherings, Magtulak Bala, Tolak Bala, as we know in Indonesia, and the Kenduri in there. And this is, trying to get rid of those is seen as contrary to the Sabahan ethos of tolerance. Now, there are many reasons for the persistence of the Kenduri. Its cosmological, community, and identity maintaining functions. Fadzila and I have emphasized in another essay the practical functions in terms of re-energizing claims to land. But in this presentation, we talk more about the differentiation functions, particularly of the Bajau Tempatan from the Bajau Laut. Now, this is not something that you'll find as a function of the Kenduri or in Sinama, the Pakanduli, in other areas, such as in Tawi-Tawi, where ethnomusicologists and anthropologists who've studied it, emphasizing the community building function with the incorporation of Tausug and other members of the community within the Pakanduli and such, and also the inclusion of local spirits as members of the community. But the Sabah context is quite different. And in order to understand that, I think you have to look at the kinds of Bajau that you find in Sabah. In the West, you have the Bajau Darat, the land Bajau, who are pastoralist agriculturalists. Many also work in urban occupations, taxi drivers in Kota Kinabalu and such, and have gained a certain touristic salience as the iconic cowboys of Sabah for their horse riding feats for tourists. Eastern Sabah, the major distinction is between the Bajau Laut, which is an exonym but is beginning to become an endonym. The previous endonym is Sama di Laut, which is still the main endonym in the Philippines. This is a transborder population of semi-nomadic boat people. The Bajau Laut in Sabah spend part of their year in houseboats, the lepa, and part in huts and strand communities. And most of the Bajau Laut in eastern Sabah are stateless. They are not citizens of Malaysia, the Philippines, or Indonesia, despite often being labeled Filipinos by other Sabahans. In contrast to those are people who are the kind of unmarked category of simply being the Bajau, a very strong political force in Sabah. They are all Malaysian citizens. They now orient to terrestrial settlements, even when on islands. They can be further distinguished toponymically. The Bajau Omadal, for example, the Bajau who live on the island of Omadal, when they want to distinguish themselves from the Bajau Laut, they sometimes will say, we are Bajau Tempatan, we are local Bajau, they are outsiders. Many of them are landholders, and they used to be known as the Bajau Kubang, probably named after the village Kubang, which served as a kind of local origin point of dispersal. Now, Fadzila and I have worked in various areas within Sabah, but I'm mainly going to concentrate on work that I did in Tun Sekaran Marine Park in 2013 and 2017. It is a zonated marine park under Sabah Parks, and I'm particularly going to concentrate on that little island you see in the center, Tatagan, to the southwest of the larger Bodgaya Island. Now, the Bajau Tempatan, who are regarded as the Pawaris, the inheritors of land, and their land rights are still recognized by Sabah Parks, regard the Bajau Laut as squatters, and they periodically tried to evict them. For example, a local Bajau Tempatan entrepreneur tried to and did evict the Bajau Laut of Sibuan in order to build a dive resort, which didn't eventuate. But this process of eviction, the kind of furthest extent of marginalization, has been really brought to a different level with Sabah Parks authorities coming in June 2024 and burning the strand huts and the lepa of most of the Bajau Laut settlements within the park. And the inhabitants have been forcibly displaced and recongregated at Pantai Manis, which is, despite the term Pantai, an inland location rather inconsistent with Bajau Laut needs and maritime orientation. The Regional Security Agency has justified this as needed for the securitization of the region, and Sabah Parks has also said it's for the ecological integrity of the park. Interestingly, the Bajau Tempatan are all for their eviction, or many of them are. And in fact, there's been considerable resentment that has been enunciated by Bajau Tempatan living around Pantai Manis with the prospect of sedentarization of the Bajau Laut in their vicinity. Now, let me talk about the kenduri itself. This was a very vernacular performance, lacking the kind of color of ones that have been studied in Tawi-Tawi. And the kenduri was both a celebration of the cultural heritage of the Bajau Tatagan and a restatement of their claims to the territory of Tatagan. Now, although they're called the Bajau Tatagan, nobody lives there anymore. There is a Bajau Laut settlement offshore, but there are no Bajau Tatagan. They all live and work on the mainland of eastern Sabah and such since 1957, although they continue to perform the kenduri there. Now, they say they are the authentic Bajau. We are the only Bajau, the authentic Bajau, the Bajau Palau, the derogatory term. They do not have any leader. They just give birth on the sea, live on the sea, because they were formerly under a datu, a term for the Tausug functionaries in the Sulu Sultanate. Thus, they have a political legitimacy and thus an authenticity that they say the Bajau Laut do not have. But primarily, they distinguish themselves in terms of Islam. The kenduri, as it was presented, was explained to me very much as an Islamic ceremony. It was at the edge of the Islamic graveyard on Tatagan, and I was told the fact that the land of the graveyard has risen as a sign of its karamat. It's very similar to what I've seen among Bugis and others in Indonesia as the sorts of rituals you'd see during Mandi Safar or Tolak Bala rituals as well. But it does include offerings and transpossession by local ancestral spirits, but they are certified as Islamic by being labeled as jinn and having very much Islamic names. Now, in contrast to the analysis of the Pakanduli and Tawi-Tawi as this re-energizing of community and performance of identity, I would say that here it is a performance of distinction. And that is because the kenduri is presented as a thoroughly Islamized ritual. The focus upon deceased imams, the Islamic credentials of ancestral spirits, the emphasis on the inculcation of ethical traits valued by Islam, and the emphasis upon how it is part of asserting the unity of the Ummah. But the Bajau Laut are said not to belong to that Ummah. Everybody in Indonesia knows of the Wali Songo bringing Islam to Java. The story I got during the performance of the kenduri was that the seven Wali first stopped in Tawi-Tawi and converted the local populace, but not the Bajau Laut, because the Bajau Laut were at sea. They were not on the land in order to be converted by the Wali Songo. Thus, they conclude that there is no religion among them because they came late. The end of the story that was given to me. So in this case, the kenduri and the explanations given for its importance is not an assertion of transnational Pan-Sama Bajau identity, as scholars such as Hanafi Hussein and Jubilado and such have emphasized, but it is a site of distinction, differentiating the Bajau Tempatan from the Bajau Laut. Now, let me say that is their assertion. My experience when I was with the Bajau Laut rather than the Bajau Tempatan was that the Bajau Laut were very much Islamic, although it was heterodox Islam, and they performed things like baca doa and other Islamic rituals, for example, when starting out to travel elsewhere. So let me briefly conclude now. I've talked about Bajau as a performative ethnic category. Adopting a maritime orientation in livelihoods can be the means of masuk Bajau, and the complementary process of distinction of how certain subgroups of Samalan-speaking people seek to differentiate themselves from other speakers of this language family. The case of Balangingi, Samal intellectuals differentiating themselves from the Samadi Laut as an other in the Sulu archipelago, according to Horvatich and others. I've concentrated in our joint presentation on the persisting endeavors of the Bajau, Tempatan, and Sabah to differentiate their own from the Bajau Laut, with the practice of Islam being central in that process of distinction, complementarily to the attribution of a lack of Islam to the Bajau Laut. Now, let me just end by talking about some factors that account for this sort of ethnic boundary making among subgroups of the Bajau. Of course, one is resource competition, especially in the seaweed sector. The resentment of Bajau Tempatan that Bajau Laut have been allowed to grow seaweed without getting a license, which would have required proving citizenship. But I think that the larger reason is the quest for political legitimacy within the context of Sabah. The Bajau Tempatan, need to assert their Islamic credentials in the political arena by dissociating themselves from the purportedly animistic Bajau Laut. And this is a way of seeking to assert their own status as being truly Sabahan. And that is in opposition to the persistent claims of Kadasan Dusun-based political parties and of other indigenous ethnic groups in Sabah that they simply remain migrants. So I will leave it at that and look forward to questions, and Fadzila will join in answering the questions later on. Terima kasih banyak. I end with this image. This is a settlement. It was sometimes called Kampung Asal. It was referred to off of Bodgaya with Tatagan in the background that has now been totally destroyed by the June 2024 evictions. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much, Pak Greg. That presentation I think, is very deep, based on research, and that explored the ethnogenesis of the Bajau, or the local Bajau or Bajau Tempatan, the long-settled Bajau who are now Malaysian citizens, endeavor to distinguish themselves from the Sea Bajau or Bajau Laut, who are mostly stateless, and many of whom continued a semi-nomadic lifestyle, living in a boat in the sea. So, and the differentiation are seen first through Kenduri practices, but Pak Greg and Fadzila have, I think, have successfully show us how the differentiation through Kenduri is actually contain a more deep factors, such as the competition to resource and other things. And thank you again, Pak Greg and Professor Majid, for your presentation. Let us move again to Professor Cynthia Chou. But first, I would like to invite, if the participant has question, you can put it on chat, and I will read it later on. Let me introduce Professor Cynthia Chou. She has been working on the Bajau topic since 2003. That was quite a long time. She's now a director of the research, the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies, C. Maxwell and Elizabeth M. Stanley Family Chair of Asian Studies, and Professor of Anthropology at the University of Iowa. Her primary research centered on ethnographic study on sea nomadism, and her latest publications include the Orang Suku Laut of Riau, Indonesia, the Inalienable Gift of Territory, and Indonesian Sea Nomads, Money, Magic, and Fear of the Orang Suku Laut of Riau. Ibu Cynthia, let me invite you to present your talk. The screen is yours.
Thank you. I think you're supposed to be controlling my slides from your end.
Do you want the operator to do that?
No, I'll just tell you next, and then if you can help me change the slides, that would be fine.
That sounds good too.
Well, I'd like to, begin by saying that this massive, as well as, very important symposium would not have been possible if not for the collaborative efforts of many individuals, many agencies, and many institutions. And I really like to thank each and every one of you for making this possible, and for having me, for making it possible for me to join all of you in this symposium as well. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which seeks to protect marine resources of sovereign nations, plus the growing global environmental concerns, have together brought the relationship between people and the ocean under increasing scrutiny. And under discussion is the question, how should people engage with the sea? And with this, contentious views have arisen, reflecting the myriad ways in which people engage with and attribute meaning to the ocean. However, as observed by Victor King, most people experience the sea in absentia, and unchallenged by conflicting experiences, the public is potentially able to image an ocean ecosystem without humans. And this imagined environment of the ocean has given rise to conflicts when incongruous meanings converge to challenge the lived experiences of diverse user groups. While most people experience the ocean as an alternative to a largely terrestrial existence, the Orang Suku Laut in the Riau Archipelago in Indonesia tell a story with a very different emphasis. While people do not just live at or on, but in and with the sea. An attendant question into this inquiry is, what does the oceanic territory of the lives of the Orang Suku Laut mean to them? The invitation to this symposium came with a proposed topic for me to speak on Orang Suku Laut culture and fluid territory. The term fluid troubled me intensely. Fluid, as many a dictionary would describe, is a substance that has no fixed shape and yields easily to external pressure, and it may continuously move and deform under an applied shear stress or external force, and they have zero shear modules and are substances which cannot resist any shear force applied to them. So instead, I hope to be able to share some ethnographic glimpses on Orang Suku Laut meanings attributed to their rhizomic oceanic territory. Next slide, please. Majority of the Orang Suku Laut are found in the Riau Lingga archipelago of Indonesia, and they are divided into various sukus or tribes, and further subdivisions prevail within these suku along the lines of kinship and territorial occupation. And they also identify themselves as Orang Suku Laut of particular islands. The sea and coastal areas have constituted their life and living spaces for centuries, and their mobile lifestyles enables them to A, conceive of unbounded communities, and B, to construct communities in networks covering large expanses of space with no definable borders. And although the Orang Suku Laut played an important role during the Malacca-Johor-Riau Sultanate, their influence waned with the appearance of European colonialists in the 19th century who labeled them as a savage people with no history. And the legacy of the European colonialists in cultivating such a negative perception of them have lasted to today. And present-day state authorities are quelling their mobility and reorientating them towards becoming citizens of the state, with obligations to observe new concepts of national borders and boundaries. And against this backdrop is also the emergence of a 1989 tripartite growth triangle agreement between Singapore, Johor, Riau to forge an economically integrated area with free movement of goods and people to create a united investment location for multi- and transnational investors. So the limelight is thus once again shining on Riau, where most of the Orang Suku Laut reside. Next slide, please. It has been 3 decades since Westerdahl's influential paper, which urged for a refocus toward the maritime cultural landscape to develop an understanding of the complex, dynamic, and evolving relationships of people and the ocean. And the rhizomatic epistemology of the Lutz and Guattari, as well as of Ingalls' relational approach of how lives are lived along lines of becoming, offer a very useful project for analyzing Orang Suku Laut understandings of movement, growth, and the oceanic territory. It paves the way for us to think about persons, relationships, and the ocean not as a static or a fluid territory, but a rhizomic world in movement wherein every part of it unfolds its growth and relations with all others. The oceanic territory, as perceived by the Orang Suku Laut, is one of pro-generation that continually revels and unravels manifold ongoing relations with humans and non-human components. The ocean is a maze of crisscrossing lines of ancestral and contemporary travel, with the most significant localities at its nodal points. Now, Ingalls' conceptual thoughts of meshwork as a metaphor for how life is lived along lines of becoming, whereby people are the lines themselves, offers a very useful framework for analyzing the oceanic world. People are wayfarers who are always somewhere, yet every somewhere is on the way to somewhere else. And each and every constituent line in the meshwork unfolds trails or lines along which life is lived. And the entanglement of these moving and unbounded lines form knots of intersecting points of generating commonalities or divergences of growth and development. Now, putting together all the trails of all the different beings that have inhabited the ocean, human, fish, and oceanic plants, ordinary and extraordinary, the result is an oceanic territory of a dense mess of intersecting pathways and assemblage of relations resembling the roots of a rhizome. Along the lines of movement where respective paths cross and commingle, each party enters into the experience of the other and makes the experience his or her own as well. So one shares in the process of knowing, growing, and developing. And the rhizomic oceanic territory is comprised by such relations and is imbued with the vitality that animates its human and non-human inhabitants. As the Orang Suku Laut explained with remarkable consistency, it is essential to look after or care for the ocean to maintain in good order the relationships it embodies. Only then can the ocean reciprocally continue to grow and nurture those who dwell therein. This is the pro-generative process. Next slide, please. Now let me talk about the entangled lines of becoming, of movement, life, and continual birth. From the perspective of the Orang Suku Laut, persons are continually coming into being, that is, undergoing generation within a process of continuous birth and growth. Birth and death are merely a matter of coming and going rather than starting and finishing. As explained by Johannes and Orang Suku Laut of Kawau, who visits the grave sites of his ancestors daily, this is what he had to say. This grave site is all Orang Suku Laut graves. This place is called Kampung Jeropat, Kampung Mencarin. This is the place where my ancestors were the first to come here to catch fish. This is the spot where they built and moored their boats. And every day someone will come to feed their roh or soul, and we bring food, cigarettes, etc. And later other family members will come and eat together with their ancestors. We eat together, of us being a family. For us, our ancestors have not died. Even in death, they are still alive. So life and death are ever-moving open lines in a cyclical sequence of transformative pro-generative processes. And spirits of ancestors are still in this world, and living people are in constant contact with them. So birth into the sphere of the dead is ultimately the source of continuing life and affirms the pro-generative process of the maritime world. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to very quickly go on into the entangled lines of movement, growth, and co-development. Orang Suku Laut movements bring places into being as nodes within a wider network of coming and going. Originally laid down through movements of the ancestors, these paths are continually retraced, but also expanded or modified in the journeys of the living people who take after them. a space or several places together can constitute a territory in which people are dispersed. And territories need not be demarcated by borders or boundaries. And there is complete openness without restriction on the flow of individuals crossing them. So visitors can access resources in a given territory so long as they let their hosts know. And ownership and claims of rights are about engaging with nature in a system of social relations. Firstly, when the Orang Suku Laut speak of owning and having rights over a place, the place serves as a home base for which they are custodians. And secondly, it covers a network of places that encompasses a home base, dispersed fishing sites, sailing paths, and moorage points. And their stories, the stories that they provide, revelatory accounts of how local spirits reveal these places to humans. So the Orang Suku Laut organized the maritime world into a rhizomic territory of a mess of networks of interrelated kin-infused cultural economic territories that are collectively owned by different groups. And these networks translate into spheres of sustenance. For example, the Orang Suku Laut of Nanga Island form a network with those in the islands of Tiangwangkang, Setengah, and Ayalingka. Hence, the Orang Suku Laut of Tiangwangkang would often sail to Pulau Nanga when they want a good harvest of sea cucumbers and jellyfish. And en route, they may stop at Pulau Setengah and Ayalingka. And correspondingly, during the season of Jomet, those from Pulau Nanga would set sail for Tiangwangkang. So this rhizomic meshwork of networks of paths and unbounded lines of co-development with the spirits that inhabit the oceans mean population dispersal to spread out resource consumption over a wide area, prevention of overexploitation of resources, and assurance of a process of creation and of new life entering the water world. Next slide, please. Now, I'd like to get into the entangled lines of occupation. In the course of history, imperial powers have sought to occupy the maritime world with networks of connections across what was perceived as a blank oceanic surface. And these lines of occupation differ from Orang Suku Laut lines of wayfaring. They restrict movement and roughshoot over lines of habitation and mobilize extraction and the outward passage of peoples and resources for the return of riches as drawn therefrom. And these lines of occupation divide in contrast to the Orang Suku Laut lines of connection. Today, nation-states and multinational corporations in the region are once again creating new lines of occupation across what they perceive to be a virgin sea. And islands in the Riau archipelago that fall within the growth triangle are rented to investors to transform them into the Caribbean of the East. And to facilitate large-scale lines of occupation in Riau, nation-states and growth triangle investors are creating a spatial configuration to collapse national borders to service a spaceless and borderless economy for the expansion of luxury resorts, golf courses, marine sports clubs, and seafood restaurants for quick economic returns. And borderless worlds, though, are premised on political choices made within the context of assessment and enforced by the states concerned. And governments of nation-states that embody the geography within this borderless region are by no means presiding over the demise of their own borders. And screening mechanisms have been put into place to mark off acceptable members versus non-members of this new spatial configuration. Mega growth triangle infrastructural projects are impinging upon Orang Suku Laut seasonal paths and places where they obtain fresh water and fish, etc. And many microenvironments have been irreversibly damaged and destroyed, and water and sand have been transformed into high-yielding resources. As an example, 6 sand mining companies in Karimun in 2005, which exported sand to Singapore, destroyed environments of several islands within just 1 year. The last slide, please. So in conclusion, what I'd like to say is that a perspective of the rhizomic complex of interlacing paths of co-development revolutionizes how and what we think of our maritime heritages, so that it is so intimately entangled in lives' embodied movements. A territory for the Orang Suku Laut is as much events and processes as there are locations on a map. And ways of life are roots that are continually worked out anew, for these are the very threads for which the living world is woven. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Cynthia, Professor Cynthia, for giving us an ethnographic glimpse on how the Orang Suku Laut offers us another thought-provoking way on how they engage with the ocean. So the maritime cultural landscape of and the relationship of people and the ocean through rhizomic oceanic territory concept. I think it's really a good explanation on to see how the relationship between the Orang Suku Laut or Orang Bajau Laut with the oceans. And I think there are some questions in the chat. We still invite participants to save some question or comments for later on. We will try to ask them and convey them during the Q&A session later on. Finally, we come to our last speaker, who I have known for quite some time. Mas Surya worked in LBH previously, and he is a highly respected activist academic who was for many years associated with LBH Indonesia, and also the founder of Trade Union Rights Center and lecturer at the Law Faculty Atma Jaya Catholic University, Jakarta, Indonesia. He completed PhD on the political economy of the law at Van Vollenhoven Institute, Leiden University, the Netherlands. And Mas Surya was appointed as the Vice Minister of Agrarian and Spatial Planning or Land Administration Office in 2019-2022. And since then, his work and research focus on the issue of conflict and natural resources, development, and just energy transition. So we look forward to hearing Mas Surya's presentation on the Agrarian Reform Program for the Orang Bajau. Mas Surya, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Can the operator assist me with the PowerPoint instead, Mbak?
All right, operator. Yeah.
Thanks. So thank you, Mbak Lilis Mulyani. Good morning, good evening, dear distinguished Madam and Sirs. Thanks to Pak Dedi Aduri, I'm able to attend and humbly share a bit of my personal experience and engagement with our sisters and brothers of the Sama Bajau people with regard to the initiative by the Ministry of Agrarian and Spatial Planning / Land Administration Office, in Bahasa the acronym is ATR-BPN, to issue the so-called HGB or HGB, Building Use Rights, as part of the government effort to recognize and respect for the Bajau peoples, especially during my appointment as Vice Minister there in October 2019 until June 2022, so only almost 3 years, less than 3 years. I will discuss a very big subject such as agrarian reform for the sea nomads in Indonesia, especially for those under second category of Pak Dedi and others earlier, the Bajau who live in the settlements on the sea. So they live in a house above the sea, supported by piles driven into the seabed. Nonetheless, I understand my paper is rather narrow, as it is mostly based on Indonesian agrarian law, especially land registration law as part of the administrative law. Is very, very narrow. So I really enjoyed the presentations earlier. It broadened my perspective so much. So I wish to further my understanding, particularly to more international and comparative perspectives that I believe you all can help me with that. Next, please. Let me start with a context mandated since 1960 with the principal agrarian law. Agrarian reform in Indonesia was only formally implemented in early 2000s as part of the political reforms following the end of the authoritarian New Order era in 1998. The Nomads who lived in the Indonesian archipelagos for ages formally qualify as recipients of the agrarian reform policy due to several reasons, at least from the Indonesian government perspective, as I understood. Yeah. First, they are marginalized. Many were considered migrants or not indigenous by the counterparts who live in the island nearby. Second, they are nomadic, although some of them start to settle in the building houses on the sea. This situation limits access to state protection, to resources and or development programs. And third, they are poor with very low living standards, lack of access, especially to healthcare and education. This I directly quoted from a presentation by one of the Director General at the Ministry ATR BPN. Next, please. Of course, the Indonesian government has an obligation to pay attention to the welfare of the Sama Bajau community, who have, as we know, unique lifestyles and needs for access to land and sea at the same time. However, in practice, recognition and protection of their existence has not been fully effective. As you could see in the paper that I presented in detail, differences and often conflicts between the governing legal regimes become the main obstacles of the implementation of agrarian reform for the Sama Bajau community. Next, please. And closely related to the agrarian reform policy for the Sama Bajau community in Indonesia is the Indonesian legal regulation on land rights for settlements on water. A breakthrough was offered, particularly with the issuance of HGB, building use rights, certificates for Sama Bajau people living in the waters of Kampung Mola, Wakatobi, Southeast Sulawesi. As we can see in the picture, President Joko Widodo of Indonesia directly handed over 525 HGB certificates covering around 6,400 Bajau fishermen in Kampung Mola, the coast of Southeast Sulawesi. Next, please. This was important as it was the first high-profile event focusing on the Sama Bajau people, as far as I understand, and their access to land rights for the settlement which are built above waters, subject to debates and clash of authorities between at least two ministries. One is the Agrarian and Special Planning Ministry and Marine and Fisheries Ministry, which each has its own laws and regulations, as well as its own law enforcement mechanism. Next, please. But the question for me was that why the Sama Bajau people want to legalize their housings. According to an interview shortly before the delivery of the HGB in Kampung Mola in 2022, there are at least three reasons they explained to me. One, as guarantee of their security in accessing their living space in the sea. Two is the certainty for their assets and their descendants, because when your assets are legalized, it can be inherited by your descendants, to be respected by the state and other people. And three, most importantly, apparently, as trigger for access to capital to improve their welfare. Next, please. Apparently, they expected that the HGB might somehow answer the previous issues they mentioned. As we know, administratively, the HGB was issued by the Wakatobi Land Administration Office under the Ministry ATR BPN, but it has to be based on permits issued by the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries, or KKP. Thus, since the beginning, there is already tension between the so-called rights regime and permits regime, which resulted in the legal uncertainty for the Sama Bajau communities regarding their assets at sea. As you might want to look deeper in the article that I sent, there was an explanation about the Indonesian Constitutional Court decision, which generally KKP based their arguments with. Next, please. This is a direct excerpt from the HGB certificates, which basically limited the uses of the certificate to almost nothing, as normally land certificates are. They are only, basically, they just simply recognized the Bajau housings, that's all. Next, please. Thus, the HGB is apparently only a recognition, but it lacks the benefits for the holders of Sama Bajau people. It does not meet the expectations and hopes of the Sama of the community, especially concerning access to capital and others. As one gentleman in Kampung Mola said disappointingly to me, if it is like this, it is the same as our previous situations. For your information, after the handing over of the HGB certificates by the presidents, I stayed in the Kampung Mola until late, and we had actually a meeting at 11 o'clock until 12 o'clock midnight, talking about this particular condition. Yeah, they started to realize what the HGB was for them. Next, please. Nevertheless, as pointed by Mr. Abdul Manan, President of Bajau Family Harmony, it can somehow reduce conflicts between Sama Bajau communities who live in the seas with the indigenous people live in the land nearby. He directly stated to me that the certificates not only provide legal certainty for our settlements in water areas, but also affirm our existence to the indigenous communities on land. And this is important. Next, please. Next. However, the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries appears to be not fully accepting of this development and has been practically slow and nearly ceased granting approval for the Sama Bajau people to obtain land rights in their water-based settlement. As I mentioned earlier, they have to release a permit first so that the Ministry of ATR BPN can start with the land administration processes. In less than 2 weeks after the activities in Wakatobi, the KKP launched a book titled The Anthology of Granting Land Rights in Marine Waters, Juridical Deviations from the Convention of the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS 1982, and Constitutional Court decisions. The book contains various articles from seminar they previously organized, showing that the KKP objection to the Ministry of ATR BPN policy on granting land rights in water areas for the Sama Bajau people. Next, please. So, in conclusion, the question remains, yeah. So, when can Sama Bajau people in Indonesia enjoy the full recognition and protection of as sea nomads, as well as the rightful citizen of this country? The answer is Wallahu alam bisawab. Only Allah knows the ultimate truth. Yet, it reminds me of a quote from Bajau Balikukup in Bajau region, East Kalimantan, when they were evicted from their settlements on the sea. Sikara itu soho dilai kami. Bo taintangku maningga garasti, umpu-umpuku nanapalumbak jana. Which is translated freely, thanks to Mbak Erni Bajau. Now you are driving us away, but I remember where your reef is. My descendants will return. For me, it's almost like a promise to keep. Thank you, and let's have a discussion.
Thank you very much, Mas Surya. I think that's a very thought-provoking thought, and how the government program try to give a security for the Orang Bajau Laut for their access to land, and also secure their access to the sea. Maybe it's really related to the previous speaker as well too, and whether this attempt to secure their access to territory give impacts to the relations they have established, whether to the ocean or to the other groups of the Bajau. Okay, we have several questions on chat. I would like to first invite Miss Azmi. Is Miss Azmi want to talk directly and open your mic and your video to give the question? So maybe I just read it out. So Ms. Azmi asked a question to Professor Jim Fox and Professor Greg. How do you see the impact of the Sama Bajau mobility and migration in ancient time to the development of Austronesia linguistic groups across Southeast Asia and the Pacific? Pak Jim?
Right. Let me just say that we are looking at different time dimensions. And we have to see the Bajau Laut as part of a very large Samal speaking group with many names and many varieties. In fact, if you look at the volume on the languages of the world, and you look just at how many different names have been applied to different locations to the Bajau and to all the Bajau Samal related people. So when we talk about ancient times, I think we can only talk about the mobility of the Samal populations beginning perhaps 1,000 years ago. Whereas my talk was looking at the migrations of other populations at an earlier date. So that the Samal are not related. The Samal are part of the Austronesian migration, but the Samal are not related to the earlier Austronesians who sailed into the Pacific. And they're not related, certainly not directly related to the populations that began to sail across the Indian Ocean to Madagascar, maybe around 700 AD. So it's all a question of time perspective on different migrations.
Thank you, Pak Jim. Pak Greg, would you like to add to that?
Well, my time perspective was looking at a more contemporary situation. But I think you have to look at the mobility of the Bajau Laut or the Samadi Laut, different terms in different regions, the Bajau in eastern Indonesia, with regard to the mobility of other ethnic groups, that there is a fluidity, and they're not the only mobile group. And there's continual interaction going on within the Sulu zone, within areas between Laut Sulawesi and Laut Flores and such. And that this is leading to that kind of flux in ethnic identification of people masuk Bajau. I'm sure Bajau entering other categories when they become sedentary and such. It is interesting going further back that linguists, I mean, that the Samadi Laut or the Bajau kind of are said to have first differentiated and come from the area around Zamboanga and Basilan, and then spread through the Sulu archipelago. But going further back to their ancestors, some historical linguists have traced them back to that mid-Burrito region. Something was going on in that region. You know, you had the sending of the groups that became the ancestors of the Austronesian-speaking peoples of Madagascar. But it's also in the vicinity of there that you had the ancestors of the Bugis, the Makasaris, the Mandar, and the Toraja, who moved to South Sulawesi. So I think we have to look, you know, ancestrally at a continual situation of great flux and movement of a lot of groups, which now we may consider them sedentary, but historically they have not been. And Bajau Laut movements, Samadi Laut movements are just a part of that larger mix.
All right. Thank you, Pak Jim and Pak Greg. I think we have another question to Pak Jim, particularly related to the Tiga Lorong Laut. The first is from Hendra Tadulako. Do you see any red string or like the connection between the Tiga Lorong Laut? And then from Luke Schroeder, for Pak Jim, the back migration from Zone 3. Could you describe a little the linguistic evidence or sources of that information, or what? Also, was this before the departure of the Malagasy from the region or after?
All right. I'm not certain of the first question. You can say these. I'm glad that's caught on that Tiga Lorong Laut. That's a good way of looking at it. And each one is a world of interest, and each one could be has to be discussed together. In posing this and saying that it is relevant, I'm using a lot of linguistic, both formal linguistic relations and particular lexical evidence to define the differences between these three. Not so much the lorong, but the zones that they create after they've gone through these lorong. So just to say a little bit more about what the back migration, I think, let's say most contemporary Austronesian studies have looked at how the populations from Zone 3 have moved into the Pacific. And that's actually easier to trace than the back migration. But when you begin to look at it, that back migration is evident in some of the societies in Maluku, very distinct social organizations of those two. And then it's had a very strong influence, not just, but very strong influence on Sumba. So Sumba is, in a way, maybe this is not the way to say it, but Sumba was a platform at one time, very early on in Austronesian migration, for a further migration from Sumba outwards into Western Austronesia. Now, putting all that together, I'm working on a paper which is growing very large, trying to put all that evidence into one space and trying to link North Maluku or parts of Maluku, Sumba, the transition zones, all the way to what's called the Northwest Sumatra group. And the strongest additional indications are that the Batak, the Gayo, and others have in fact come originally as part of that long migration. So let's say that what I'm saying is controversial, and I'm sure it will upset some people when I say it. But I think the evidence is to me so strong that it needs to be put down and presented, and that's what I'm working on. So give me time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pak Jim. We're looking forward for your next findings then. Ibu Fazila, you would like to add to Pak Greg, but maybe I can add another 2 questions to Pak Greg and you.
Can you? I can't see myself, but can you hear me?
Yes, I can. We can hear you clearly.
Yeah.
Here's another.
Thank you. There's a question that has not been addressed very much from earlier on. Question about Austronesian migration, but coupled with that question was about Islamic spread or Islamization in Sabah of Bajau Laut. Yes, the question was whether it's purely a government attempt or whether it is also non-government by the tabligh groups. Yeah. So government tends to acknowledge, yes, religious teaching is getting deeper and more extensive. Governments tend to acknowledge people with their own training, with certification, but many Bajau Laut cannot get that certification if they don't have citizenship. Yeah, so there are all kinds of negotiation of the rules. For example, there'll be volunteer Bajau Laut ustaz trained in Indonesia, especially in Sulawesi. And there are some schools that start as secular but teach Islam as well, that are run by non-government organizations. So again, the state might feel very insecure with what we can term as border work. You know, in the borders, people do all kinds of things. One of the border work that was already mentioned by Greg was the distancing process. I have just been to Sulawesi, Tawi-Tawi, before this conference actually. So it might be an earlier Sulu Zone conference organized by University of the Philippines and Mindanao State University in Bongao, in Tawi-Tawi, where border work there is about not acknowledging the word Bajau. So everyone was sama, because Bajau is only referred to the Bajau Laut, and they don't want that. So everyone is sama. And then in Sabah, the kind of border work that is linked to villages, as we, the Bajau Simunul or Bajau Bangau, is usually used by people who are already sedentarized with land. That brings the issue of land just now. I would like to ask that question on land, because they can say that they are Bajau Simunul because they have space at Simunul. Whereas Bajau Laut may want a broader view of the sea, wherever their pelabuhan might be, wherever they go. So Bajau Laut do not necessarily want to admit that they are from Tawi-Tawi or from Bangau, or they will say, kami orang Laut. We are Laut. And also there is a kind of appropriation, defense of that name, Laut, by geography. They say we are sea people, so what's wrong with being at sea? And a kind of new nascent feeling of wanting to appropriate the Laut name, So it used to be no is the lowest of the low, but there are groups now saying we are Laut. So what? You are land and we are Laut. So that's kind of border work that's emerging now. But the government is still interested in the old form of citizenship direction, which calls for assimilation and sedentarization. And that's what Greg was mentioning about resettlement at a place on the mainland called Pantai Manis. And this comes from the horse's mouth. The district office wants them to be sedentarized, to be modern. So that's my contribution about the present feeling, the nuances that's Bajau themselves are engaged in. They are not totally only victims. And also what the government and the non-government organizations together are contributing. We haven't talked, for example, about the carving of territory, what we call in social science by Van der Geest and Nancy Peluso, as territorialization. The carving of the Sulu Sea near Sempurna and outside Sabah into marine protected areas, huge areas, 8,000 square kilometers for one of them, which is Tun Mustafa Park, and where Greg and I are working on in the Tun Sakaran Park near Sampurna. That's a few thousand kilometers, and there is a huge one of over 10,000 square kilometers of the Sampurna conservation area. The carving up of those territories means that the space for living, owning, like Surya was talking about land, I would like to know about that later. I won't monopolize the time. So the carving of land under territorialization means two things. One, newcomers new players are encouraged, tourism, from mainland China and from Korea. And then the other one is about space for Bajau Laut, their teba, the space, the seascape has been totally reduced. And yet they are supposed to be, that's the idea of sedentarization too, That's keep them safe. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fazila. I think we have two questions for Professor Cynthia, and Surya has already answered the question on the chat, but maybe you can also answer Professor Fazila question to you, Surya, later. Professor Ibu Cynthia, there are two questions for you. First one is why the Suku Laut still stay on both? Why they are not creating a new cosmology by living in the land? And then the second one is there work underway to support orang Suku Laut communities to document and communicate their centuries-long ongoing progeneration of the Riau Lingga archipelago, marine, coastal, and forest, and challenge the proliferation of economic development projects that seeks to deny their presence and access?
Okay, let me answer the first question first, and I might need you to repeat the second question. The first question, I think at the start of this symposium, Pak Dedi did say that, sea nomads, there are three types now. One still fully nomadic, one semi-nomadic, and one who have sort of moved further inland. It's the same for the orang Suku Laut. There are some who are still fully nomadic, some who are semi-nomadic, and some who have, been moved very much inland. So it's not that they don't want to change. It's a choice as to, whether they would like to be fully nomadic or not. But there have been lots of pressures to move them ashore. Can you repeat the second question for me again?
Is there any work underway to support the orang Suku Laut regarding the new project development?
Yeah, I think the question that we often get is, how can the orang Laut, engage themselves, or are they willing to be engaged in so-called developmental modernization projects, etc.? I think we can actually turn the question around to ask about how can we or the investors, engage the orang Suku Laut rather than putting the fault on the orang Laut not wanting to engage. The orang Laut most certainly do want to engage, but often they are cast into the peripheries and, condescended. And when there are projects of modernization and development coming in, they're often, moved out of the areas that they have been occupying. And instead, you have people from the outside coming, further from Indonesia into their spaces to take over areas in which they have actually inhabited for many generations.
Thank you, Professor. So we move to Surya. There are several questions. You apparently have answered some, but maybe you can also answer directly. So what is the basic reason for Indonesian government issue certificates, if not for recognition or for the Bajau for a place? Or is it just based on certificate to be used as bank collateral, or because they could be trapped in debt and credits because of that?
Well, to be honest, originally I wanted them to gain the full land rights, because by our ministry's laws, they can actually, although they have the so-called 3R, rights, restriction, and responsibilities to fulfill. So they cannot destroy the sea ecology, they cannot destroy the reefs, etc. But they are entitled for land title recognition by the government in the sense of certificates, in meaning the certificates. But the thing is, in order to issue that certificate, there is this job creation law that created a new mechanism that it requires permission from the KKP, the Ministry of Fisheries and Marine and Fisheries. Without that permission, it is illegal to issue a certificate for these people. And the second thing, the ATR BPN apparently interpreted that regulation by very much limiting the possibilities to use the certificates for anything other than just simply recognition, like collateral to the bank. And even so what happened in Kampung Mola, I don't know, people are not aware about that. I saw many houses on land that used to be the sea, the waters, so they simply reclaimed it voluntarily with their own money, with the dead reefs. And by doing that, the ATR BPN can proceed with the land titlement. KKP didn't do anything because it's land already, not sea anymore. And somehow only several houses that can do that. Other houses cannot do that. So in Kampung Mola, you might find like land, but there is also big holes in between the houses because and there is water inside, and of course rubbish, garbage. It's like a big garbage in the middle of this kampung. So it's for me, it's more like the commitment and the attention and probably the empathy of the Indonesian government that we need more than ever.
Okay. Thank you. I originally want to ask all the speakers to give like half a minute's conclusions, or like yeah, or maybe your insights for the last one. Pak Jim, Pak Greg, Bu Cynthia, Mas Surya.
All right, if I may, let me just take a different tack, because I've worked with the Bajau Laut, the Bajau on Rote, and they have a settlement called Tanjung. It's a recent settlement in Tanjung, and majority of the Bajau on Tanjung have come from Mola and recognize their original origins from Mola. So that, in a general sense, is the way. But I remember once asking one particular Bajau where he came from, and he was an elder Bajau, and he set out what I would call a topogeny. Instead of a genealogy, he explained his origins by pointing to all of the different settlements he had lived in from an early age. And it was interesting because it went on. And he was born in a settlement in Maluku, and then was in various settlements in as I remember it, in Tukang Besi, including Molo. And then he had moved down to the Bay of Kupang. And then he had moved back up to Molo again. And then he had moved down to Tanjung. So it was a long recitation, 7, 8, 9 stages or more, where he just explained how he had been, how his origin by the places in which he resided. And I found that as interesting. It's more interesting than having a genealogy of father to grandfather and whatnot. They don't remember those, but a person remembers his places of origin. So I just leave you with that idea. Topogeny is more important than genealogy.
Thank you, Pak Jim. Professor Cynthia or Professor Greg, first probably last message for this session. Half a minute each. I'm sorry, Bu Fazila.
Oh, are you talking to me?
I would like to invite first Prof. Greg and Cynthia to give a last message.
Okay.
And
just to be brief, in the list of kind of needs and priorities for further work of that's been established by this opening symposium on sea nomads, there was one conspicuous omission, and that is the issue of citizenship and more widely cultural belonging, or if you wish, the term that Renato Rosaldo endeavored to popularize, cultural citizenship. It's not as much citizenship. Legal citizenship is not really an issue in Indonesia, which has been much more generous, but also because sedentarization has probably advanced more in Indonesia than in other places. But it is still a problem in Malaysia for the Samadhi Laut, the Bajau Laut. There is de jure, there are no channels for them, and this has to do with the politics of being Sabahan. It's still a problem in the Philippines, not de jure, but de facto. It is difficult to get the documents to gain citizenship in the Philippines, although there are the channels. The Philippines is a signatory to all the conventions on statelessness. It's the only one in the entire ASEAN region, which is. But I do think that needs to be brought forward because a lot of these divergences, conflicts, and such hinge on that distinction of citizenship. So I'll leave it at that.
thank you, Greg. Professor Cynthia?
Yeah, I think, just from the few presentations that we've just had, this morning, we can see that, the oceanic world is really one which is very dynamic, lots of things that are going on. And what I really do hope that we can see as the symposium progresses, that the image of the oceanic ecosystem is not one that is void of humans, and that it is really important that, decisions pertaining to marine resource protection and environmental concerns really should not just be made by people who are absent from the oceans, but people who actually, have engaged with the ocean. I'll just give you an example. I once spoke to a former officer from the Singapore National Environmental Agency about Pulau Semakau, which I think we will hear, later on when with one of the speakers in this symposium. And this island of Semakau is in amalgamation with Pulau Seking, which now forms the only sort of landfill in Singapore. And this officer, in the course of their duty, had to carry out numerous official tours of Pulau Semakau for visitors. But this officer was really surprised to hear from me that these islands were once upon a time inhabited, by islanders. So it's, this vision that it's a virgin sea and we sort of can, take over everything and, have projects of modernization and development without really understanding the history and the intricacies of what really makes the oceanic world a very lively and important place for us. So I think this symposium is extremely important, and I'm really looking forward to all the talks, for the rest of the talks of this symposium.
Thank you, Cynthia. Mas Surya, one last brief statement.
Can we have Ibu Fazila first?
Yes, Ibu Fazila.
Love to hear.
I'm sorry, we are running out of time.
Thanks.
Oh, you're still on mute.
I'd love to hear Ibu Fazila. Is that possible, Mbak Lilis?
Yeah, but Fazila is still on mute.
Oh.
Okay. Now, thank you, Pak Surya. I have learned from reading and from your presentation today very much, because this very issue of land rights have been brought to me by various NGOs and government agencies, because of my work previously for 15, 20 years on customary land. And it was found that when looking at the sea, the ordinance, the land ordinance is still applicable to communities of the sea. But there are so many questions because land has different markers for people to use as claims. Whereas Bajau Laut have lepa and maybe a burial ground, but nothing more than that. I mean, the markers are not well recognized by the land ordinance, which is being used by land organizations or institutions of the state to transfer to the sea. So there's a big debate now whether or not some amendment has to be done to the land ordinance so that there is incorporation of the sea issue. They are not interested in UNCLOS because it's so far away, 200 kilometers. And then the other thing that I learned from you is that despite Malaysia not having big heart, like Greg was saying, of citizenship, unlike Indonesia, which has a big heart and recognize them as citizens, the effect in the end are more or less the same, isn't it? That's what you're saying in your paper. The effect for Bajau Laut is still insecurity, but I don't understand the difference between rights and permits regime. So maybe that's where the difficulty lies. So I would like to talk to you more through our network and learn from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bu Fazila. And Mas Surya, last statement.
Thank you, Madam. Well, as someone that came, although very shortly, from the government, I realized that sometimes the government underestimate the resilience of these people, the sea nomads people in our country, especially. The quotes from the Bajau Balikukup, Sikara itu soho dilai kami, bo tentangku maningga garas di umpu-umpuku na napalumbak jana. Now you are driving us away, but I remember where your reef is, my descendants will return. So sooner or later, we have to face this, honestly and hopefully with respect. So see you later.
All right, we are running out of time. I'm really sorry for the other participants and who already posed the questions. Maybe the speakers can answer that later on chat if you are still here. Once again, thank you for the great presentations to Professor Jim Fox, Professor Greg, Professor Cynthia, Professor Fazila, and Mas Surya Tjandra. I will not conclude this discussion, but I hope those notes that left by these speakers can be of help to the organizer to formulate further recommendation or session resume regarding the culture and network of sea nomads in Southeast Asia. Once again, thank you very much for all your presentation and participations. With this remark, I close the session and back to the host. Thank you very much. Great session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ibu Lilis, for moderating the first sessions, and also our speakers. Thank you so much for the interesting discussion. So that the discussion running out of time, but it's okay. Let's make it our discussion so interesting and fun. Well, we have time for a break around about 15 minutes to go to have some rest. And we will continue to the second session about 11:45 maybe. Yes, so we please you to have a break for some minutes, around 15 minutes, and we wish you to come back, join the discussions on 11:45. Thank you so much and get ready for this session number 2. Thank you.